He'd already had one narrow escape when the policeman from London came sniffing round his special place. But he'd dealt with him, and he'd kept the policeman's hat as a souvenir of his rare bit of good fortune. He liked the hat, because it reminded him of those happier days before they began to hunt him like an animal. The light was fading, but the darkness held no dread for him. Not any more. When he'd first begun living up on the ridge, he'd felt there were ghosts all around him, the ghosts of the workers who'd laboured in the quarries and ancient mines, and the ghosts of the suicides, whose unquiet spirits haunted Oak Tree Edge where they'd chosen to end their lives. There was even the little ghost of Peter's twin brother, and whenever he found himself near the standing stones at dusk, he sensed the presence of his small, sad wraith. In his clearer moments, he understood that these hauntings were produced by his mind. Then at other times he cowered in his cave, covering his ears against the sound of gunfire, eyes tightly shut, and his body paralyzed with terror. Sometimes he cried. Peter had seen him cry, and had taken his hand and held it until he stopped. Seeing the old woman in the cemetery so soon after his arrival in the village had been a rare stroke of good fortune. He'd been visiting the grave of his beloved grandmother when he'd seen Mrs. Pierce arrive with her basket and hidden himself behind a large tombstone. He'd watched her place something on a grave some distance away, and as soon as she'd gone, he'd hurried over to investigate and found a package wrapped in greaseproof paper containing bread, cheese, and ham. He'd hardly been able to believe his luck when she returned every night with more. Sometimes apples, sometimes slices of pie. Unwittingly, she'd fed him for weeks, and he'd come to regard her as his guardian angel. On the night of Patience Bailey's death, he'd got to the cemetery later than usual because he'd had one of his turns and been unable to leave the sanctuary of the ridge for an hour or so. When he'd eventually arrived, his mind had been conjuring snipers behind each headstone, and for a while he'd cowered behind a memorial with his hands clamped against his ears to block out the noise of gunfire. He cursed the episodes he'd experienced since that dreadful day at the front, and he couldn't help wondering whether he'd have been able to save Patience that night if he'd been more alert to what had really been happening around him. Then there was a possibility that filled him with dread. In his confused state, had he mistaken Patience for an enemy soldier and killed her? But could he have killed his unwitting benefactor, Mrs. Pierce, without realizing it? He thought not, but he couldn't be absolutely sure. Not when the waking nightmares overwhelmed his mind and body. Although Peter had brought him as much food as he could lay his hands on, it wasn't enough, and hunger was gnawing at his stomach, which meant he'd soon have to venture out. At times he'd been tempted to go to the one place he knew he'd be taken in and fed. But if he went there, they'd come for him, and then his only future would be death by firing squad. He'd seen men die like that during the war. They'd called them cowards, but the Shadow Man knew this wasn't true. Pulling the hat down to shade his face and hugging his greatcoat around his thin body, he set off down the road, praying he'd meet nobody on the way. Although on the few occasions he'd been spotted, people had taken him for a vagrant passing through. Some had given him a few coins, assuming his makeshift mask hid some terrible disfigurement acquired in battle. But nobody had ever asked questions. By the time he passed the cemetery, it was dark, and he looked across at the lodge, as he always did, but there was no sign of Peter in the lighted windows. He wondered where the teacher lived. In those awkward moments of conversation, it had been hard enough to explain his situation, without making small talk as well. Now he wanted to know. He walked on beyond the edge of the village into the countryside and came to a small brick farmhouse, isolated from its neighbours by fields of grazing cattle.